Bum, bum, bum. Bum, 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 bum. Hey, Joanne, come on in here. The rest of you, get on in here. It's a very special coffee with Scott Adams this morning. I'll bet you can't wait. I'm going to be trying something new with the sound, so we'll see if that works. We're going to use one microphone for both sources. In a moment, I'm going to do an introduction. But before that, it's time for the simultaneous sip. Grab your cup, your mug, your chalice, your vessel full of beverages. I like coffee. And join me for the simultaneous sip. You're a little late there.
A little late. Delayed.
All right, I am delighted to introduce Brandon Darby, Director of Breitbart's Border and Cartel Projects. In other words, a border expert, someone who's going to fill us in a way you have not been filled in on the topic of the caravan and maybe some immigration in general. So I'm going to jump in with some questions. I'll be watching your comments in case you have any questions. If you're having trouble seeing this because the comments are scrolling by and covering up either of our faces, turn your device sideways, and then the comments and the visuals will be in separate places. So, Brandon, give me a little background. Tell the people where you're located. Where do you work out of?
I'm in West Texas, Northwest Texas, kind of near Lubbock, Texas.
Okay.
But my team, we have people in Mexico. Half of our team is actually in Mexico, and the rest are all along the border. And we spend about 10 days per month traveling the 9 sectors of the southwest border, as we have for about 5 years now.
Wow. I'm going to ask you some general questions and then get to some specific. Are there any big themes that you think the public has not been sufficiently informed about? In other words, is there anything that the people watching this would say, my God, I didn't know that about the border or about immigration? Anything jump out?
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have? Because there's a lot.
Well, let's hit the top 3.
Top 3. Okay, first off, when people say the border is secure and others say the border is unsecured, border is safe, border is unsafe, both are telling the truth in a way. They're both telling half-truths. Some areas along the border are very safe and some areas are not. This has a lot to do with the nature of the Mexican cartel who controls that portion of our border. Very different beasts, the different groups from Gulf Cartel to Los Zetas to the Sinaloa. Another issue that I think people don't realize...
Let me jump in. Now, when I hear that the cartels are controlling the border in the sense of they're charging the immigrants to get safe passage, that's what you're talking about?
No, they actually control the border. So in some areas, like if we were in the Tucson sector in Arizona,
right,
they have scouts, the Sinaloa groups there, the Los Mimos and Los Salazar, they have scouts on mountaintops in the U.S. with sophisticated scopes and sophisticated communications gear, and they actually help to navigate drug loads through the remote territories out there. So they keep track of and monitor where all of our Border Patrol agents are at that time, where all of U.S. law enforcement assets are. I think a lot of people don't realize that. And that's not just Breitbart reporting, that's mainstream outlets that acknowledge that as well, especially local outlets in Arizona.
So, but what you described, I wouldn't call controlling the border, more like there are smugglers who know where the Border Patrol is. Is that a better explanation?
No, because like in the Tucson sector, for instance, we wrote about a case a couple of years ago where a guy tried to go through that territory and they brutalized this person, and it's something that happens a lot. So if other people try to utilize that territory for illicit purposes, those people are either murdered or sodomized in some cases, or these graphic things happen to people who utilize that territory. So in that sense, it is kind of appropriate to say they control the criminal activity. Let's say that.
So if you were an illegal immigrant, you would have to deal with them, or you're not going to get across safely.
You would get murdered, yeah.
Okay.
If you tried to cross without paying them.
All right. And to what extent do U.S. authorities know where the personnel is on the cartel end of things at the border? Do we know where they are, the same as they know where we are?
In some cases. So when we talk about the border, this kind of goes back to your first question. One of the problems is that most people in the U.S. talking about the border really don't know what the hell they're talking about. And even if they live on the border, like someone like Beto O'Rourke, for instance, he knows about his little section of border that he lives on. But he doesn't understand the border, the ecosystem as a whole. And that's a problem that we have. So the border region is not only the U.S. side of the border, but it's also the Mexican side of the border. The whole region is the border region. So some portions of that region, like the south side, are absolutely controlled by cartels. So if we were to go to Los Zetas and Gulf Cartel territory, south of Texas, all of the politicians either work with the cartels or they get murdered. The journalists, even in the mainstream outlets, they're not able to write what they want to write without getting murdered. So every news outlet has a person working there called a link. And that link tells people what they can and can't write, and that link answers to the cartel, the regional cartel. So they really do control a significant portion of that border. They control like what legal commerce goes through, and they take a pesos or a tax on all of the legal commerce that goes through the ports of entry.
Is there a functioning government in Mexico, or are they just making sure the garbage gets picked up, but otherwise the cartels are running the federal government? Or is it more of a border situation that the cartels control?
Well, there's 30, I believe 31 states in the federal district, which is like Mexico City, kind of like our D.C. D.C. has a very functioning government, or Mexico City has a very functioning government. But several regions, probably about 16 Mexican states, are actually under the physical control of transnational criminal organizations. If we look at the state of Tamaulipas, which is immediately south of Texas and the Rio Grande Valley sector, right. The last two governors of Tamaulipas are fugitives of U.S. justice. One is in U.S. prison, jail right now. One is about to get extradited to the U.S. because they worked for Mexican cartels. They were part of the criminal network. Another state south of Texas, Coahuila, the 2 governors ago was a Zeta governor, so he was working for the cartel. The current president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, on his way out, Enrique Peña Nieto, he was put into power. A lot of the money that was used was money from shell corporations that were supplied by Mexican cartels.
Yeah, what about the new guy, the new president?
AMLO, I don't have any specific information derogatory on him that he's connected to cartels. There's nothing specific yet. It'll take time for us to see and people to go through money and funds and try to track it back. But the chances are, it's very unlikely in Mexico that someone isn't, because if the way they work there, it's like they call it silver or lead, right? So they say, can we pay you a bunch of money to do what we want, or do you want to die? Do you want us to shoot you? And that's what they do. So most of Mexico is under the control of transnational paramilitary criminal organizations.
So what in theory, I'm just sort of spitballing here. In theory, could the U.S. government bribe the cartels to stop immigration?
Yes, 100%. But see, the cartel, this is where it's tricky, Scott, and this is where, like I said, people just don't comprehend it, because it does take a little bit of looking at it, right, outside the box. The cartels really aren't the problems. The problems are picture like an organized criminal circle, okay? And the cartel boss is just one little part of that circle. That's the drug part and the whatever else part. But there's all of these other people on that circle: politicians, accountants, lawyers, money makers, and what have you, financiers, bankers. and they're all part of this organized criminal circle. Well, we only go after the cartel part of that circle, and the rest of that circle, they're all too happy to let us think that El Chapo is the mastermind, but that entire circle keeps operating, and they just put another El Chapo in there.
Okay.
And so several parts of our government realize that, like the Treasury Department puts the rest of this circle on the blacklist, and they say they're kingpins, right?
Right.
But the other parts of our government don't go after those people because many of them are politicians, and they're the very diplomats that we rely on for diplomacy with Mexico. So all of what the U.S. government can do in Mexico is dependent upon the State Department's approval, the U.S. State Department. The State Department requires that U.S. law enforcement agencies balance their law enforcement priorities with the State Department's diplomatic concerns.
Okay. So...
And, yeah, it's kind of complex and messed up. It's just completely messed up. But we could, in theory, utilize that same corrupt system that bad guys use.
Right.
We could use that for good and to get our bidding, but we don't.
Okay, so we'd have to start killing politicians. we'd have to compete with the cartel. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding about that. That's not real.
We could push extradition. We could push extradition for what they do to our country. We could. There's a lot of paperwork that has to get done. People to get charged and the people to get the paperwork to be extradited. We could push that, and we could utilize resources in creative ways to get those people in U.S. custody. Yeah.
So we could lawyer them to death until they either start ignoring us or start handing over some perps. All right.
Well, the other thing we could do, Scott, is people don't realize this, but several groups like Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, some of the nastiest in Mexico, they routinely make as much or more from illegal immigration than they do from narcotics. So they're actually illegal immigration cartels. So one thing we could do if we really wanted to do something about the cartels is we could change U.S. policies and not allow those cartels to be successful, and we could take out at least a third of their resources just simply by stopping illegal immigration, the pull factors.
Wow. And do we know where the leaders and the headquarters are of these cartels? In other words, do you think that our deepest spooks could tell you exactly where the cartel leaders are?
Our deepest spooks, probably not. We identify where most of them are, the ones that are significant. And I say we, I mean our Breitbart team. We routinely either print that information. Sometimes we share it with different governmental agencies, which is kind of controversial. But we had a situation recently where about a year ago, the Mexican military was sent into a state called Michoacan. And the state is controlled by a Mexican cartel. The army was sent in to find this cartel boss, and they never could find him. And then we got a hold of pictures showing the military commander fraternizing with the cartel boss on several occasions, smoking cigarettes and drinking. And we published them in English and Spanish, these stories. And a week later, Mexico got embarrassed, and they had to go in and arrest the cartel boss, So we are able to find out where they are, and the U.S. government could if they put energy into it, but they don't.
All right. Now, could you tell me with any authority that we're not droning these cartel guys? Are we definitely not droning anybody?
Definitely not droning them. That's correct.
And why not?
Well, the problem with a lot of these folks is that the vast majority of their armies, the vast majority of the people they rely upon are underage or are minors. Minors from very poor backgrounds, and people who probably would have chosen another life had they had an opportunity or something different to do. They really are in a lot of these areas, especially along the border. They really are in a bad spot, So I'm not trying to sound like a raging liberal or something here, but it really is a bad spot that a lot of these communities are in, and it makes it very easy for these cartels to prey upon them. So a lot of times what you see whenever somebody is really heinous is they get detained or arrested in Mexico, and then they get put into a jail or prison controlled by a rival group, and those people get murdered. And that happens pretty routinely, once or twice a month these kind of things happen. But we're not handling it that way. We're not handling it. Some of the groups, it would be inappropriate to. Some of the groups like Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, there are factions that really have crossed that line into foreign terror groups, but we don't designate them as such because of diplomatic reasons.
Okay. Now let's talk about the Caravan. Where are the pictures of all the trucks that are carrying these people? Because they're clearly not walking that distance.
Well, part of the issue there is that it's very difficult to do actual journalism on the Caravan. Like in our case, it would be difficult for us to go down there and to make that known because of what we do. So most U.S. media outlets, when they go into Mexico, they actually pay the cartel for permission to do reporting. So they pay a local guide or a fixer, and that fixer actually works with the cartel, and they get permission from the cartel. The cartel tells them what they can and can't publish, right? What they can and can't cover. And they abide by that. And most people don't realize that. Like when National Geographic goes into Mexico, they always pay a fixer, and that fixer gives the money to the cartel, and the cartel says, okay, you have 48 hours here. Don't talk about drugs and don't talk about this. Don't show this, don't show that. And people abide by that. So it makes it very difficult to get actual journalism on something like this. It's easier if you go in, sometimes like we'll go into Mexico in the trunk of a car. Sometimes we'll go in on foot, and we have all these different ways to get in and get out to get our stories. But if you're going somewhere and staying for multiple days or a long period of time, it becomes very risky.
Wow. So basically the reporting we're getting out of Mexico is only what the cartel approves, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow, who knew that? Now, if you were to draw a border map, and you were to fill in the places along the border on the Mexican side that are cartel controlled, what percentage of the entire border would look like it's cartel controlled?
Well, let's walk through this real quick. I don't mean to bore anybody, but let's walk through it. So if you started in California, okay, you would have the Tijuana cartel, and they are ruthless and they control that territory. Immediately after Tijuana, somewhere halfway between Tijuana and El Centro, basically in California, immediately after that it becomes the Sinaloa Federation. They control all of the territory. Various groups, right, like who pledge allegiance to the Sinaloa Cartel, control all of the territory all the way until you get to Juarez, Mexico. And Juarez is controlled by La Linea and the Juarez Cartel. Then when you get about 40 miles outside of El Paso going east, it becomes the Sinaloa Cartel again until you get to Coahuila, which is kind of south of Del Rio, Texas. And then it becomes Los Zetas, the Los Zetas Cartel. And they control all the way into Nuevo Laredo, really Zapata, Texas. And then after that, it becomes a Gulf Cartel. But the entirety of the U.S.-Mexico border on the Mexico side is controlled by transnational criminal organizations. And something that a lot of people don't realize is that the United States is the territories, we're divvied up into cartel territories as well. So like Washington State is Sinaloa Cartel. California is Tijuana and the Sinaloa Cartel. If you were to go to Alabama, that's the territory of a Guatemalan transnational criminal group. Parts of Texas are controlled by, the entirety of the U.S. is divvied up into territories for Mexican cartels.
Jesus.
And they try to respect that so they don't have war.
Now, when we're talking about building a wall to reduce immigration, after hearing this conversation, it seems like that's completely the wrong way to frame this. We should be building a wall between the United States and the cartels. Mexico isn't really a player in this, is it?
No. So so I am a supporter of building physical barriers, if that be a wall in some places or fencing. I am a supporter of doing that in areas where it's needed. That said, I will of the issues that we're facing, saying build the wall is really, it's one of, I don't know how to say this nicely. It's it's a political ploy designed to give supporters hope that there's something they can do, there's something strong and singular that they can do to fix a set of problems, but it doesn't really resolve the problems. And let me explain. Most of the problems that we're having with illegal immigration right now, it's actually not even illegal immigration. It's people coming here and they're utilizing key components of our existing laws. So all they have to do is set foot on U.S. territory and say, I want asylum, and then we have to process them. All they have to do is set foot on U.S. territory and give birth, and then that's a U.S. citizen, and then we can't deport the only caregiver for a U.S. citizen infant or minor.
Okay.
So if most of the places that we have a physical wall, like if you look at Texas, the physical barrier is actually 40 to 100 yards into the United States territory. So none of that is going to get solved. None of this problem is going to get solved by a barrier that isn't in the middle of the Rio Grande, right? That isn't in the middle of the river, because all they have to do is get on U.S. territory. And when you look at opiates, for instance, and we keep saying like, hey, this opiate crisis is out of control, we need to build the wall, right? Well, if you look at the most recent DEA's National Drug Threat Assessment, most of the 89% actually, they say, of the heroin that comes into the U.S. comes through ports of entry, meaning they come in vehicles and people at the legitimate gates. It has nothing to do with in between ports of entry where the border wall would be. The wall didn't move, it wouldn't stop it.
Yeah, I think most people understand that a wall isn't going to do much to stop drugs because there are too many workarounds. But you said I thought you started that conversation by saying you favor the wall, but then you gave two reasons not to favor the wall. So there's a part missing.
Right. So let me explain. First off, the concept of the wall, I use that terminology, and I probably shouldn't. Trump uses the terminology. Everyone else uses the terminology. But if you ever listen to Trump specifically talk about it without in any detail, he says about half of the U.S. border needs portions of a wall or fence or some other type of barrier. Let's just call it a wall.
Right.
Right. So if you were in Laredo, Texas, where there's no physical barriers between bad neighborhoods in Mexico and bad neighborhoods in the United States, there's just the river, which is shallow and only 40 yards across. If you were there, you would say, you know what, we need some type of physical barrier to stop the type of behaviors that are crossing the border in these areas. Okay, so that would be a good candidate for a physical barrier. Areas in between densely populated urban areas, that's a good candidate for a physical barrier. Areas like in the Big Bend sector where you have hundreds of miles before you get to human populations again in the U.S., that's not a good candidate for a physical barrier, because we have other mechanisms that we could use to get drug mules or people crossing or what have you. That's a good candidate for drones, and that's a good candidate for technology and for more human resources, right? Border Patrol agents.
But hold on, before you go too far. In the areas that you say would be good candidates for a wall, we still have the problem that people just have to stand on U.S. soil and then the legal system kicks in, and the wall would probably not be on the exact border. If they have 2 feet of American, all they have to do is walk up and hold onto the wall, and they're in America, right?
Well, sort of. Remember earlier when we talked about the nature of the criminal groups of the cartels?
Right.
Let's talk about this. So along most of the U.S.-Mexico border, you don't see a lot of illegal immigration. You see some, but not a lot. And the reason you don't see a lot is because the Sinaloa Cartel, who controls most of our border, the Sinaloa Cartel is more like the old school mafia, right? They want to make money today, but they're looking at their long-term profit sustainability. They want to make money tomorrow and the next day and the next year. They're concerned about all of it. They're very professional. If you go to the Gulf Cartel in the Zetas, it's a lot of younger guys who are controlling it in their early 20s. They're more like glorified gangbangers, and they don't care about tomorrow. All they want to do is make money today. That's why we look at the crisis that happened in 2014. It was all centered in Texas and the Rio Grande Valley sector and the Laredo sector, in the two territories controlled by the two cartels who don't care about tomorrow. Because even though they knew that if they brought hundreds and hundreds and thousands of children to our border and people to our border, they knew that that was going to result in more law enforcement presence tomorrow, but they didn't care. They just wanted their money today. And the other cartels along the border who are more professional, they said, wait a minute, we don't want these people coming here because it's going to bring more attention and more border patrol agents, and we're not going to get our drug loads through. So it just depends on the nature of the criminal organization south of the border who's controlling that territory.
But wait, Brandon. So I'm missing the connection between what would be a case where a wall would work, given that the wall is going to be American territory, and somebody just has to come up and, get on our territory, and the legal system of the U.S. kicks in, and then they can stay. So what would be an example? Where, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so what we're experiencing right now with people seeking asylum, right? That's about 55% or so of our problem with people coming illegally or illicitly or irregularly, however you want to technically say it, right? Regardless of your political perspective. That's about 55% of our problem. So we talked about heroin and 89% coming through ports of entry. Well, there's still 11% coming illicitly across the border, right? So, and a lot of that is happening in neighborhoods, like I said, in Laredo, Texas, and from between Nuevo Laredo and Mexico and Laredo and what have you. So there are still problems to address, and there are, we still have 45% or so of the people crossing the border who are sneaking across the border and trying to enter the U.S. and not just claiming asylum. So we still have to address that problem, even though it's not the bulk of the problem.
Well, 45%'s a big part. So
big chunk.
Yeah. So okay. Now let's talk about the caravan. Do you have any visibility on what percentage of the caravan, if any, are criminals and cartel members or MS-13?
No, not at all. I would tell you that the majority of people. Let's talk about why caravans exist for a second. Okay. Caravans exist. Like you'll notice, like the last caravan, most of the people who came to the U.S., they didn't come to Texas. They didn't come through. The closest region for them to walk to or get to was Texas, but they didn't go there. They went all the way to California or to Arizona. Why did they do that? They did that because of the nature of the cartels in Mexico who control specific regions. So when women, for instance, leave Central America to come to the U.S., there is the expectation of multiple sexual assaults along the way. And again, that's not just Breitbart reporting, that's Amnesty International, the United Nations Office of Refugee Resettlement. We could go down the line. And what they say is that up to 80% of Central American females are sexually assaulted on their journey from Central America into the United States to enter across our border.
Can I ask a quick question about that?
Yeah.
Given that most of the people in the caravan are male, if this were a United States caravan, the amount of physical assault would be zero because there would be enough men who would stop it that would overwhelm the number of people who would want to do it. What's different about the caravan that the...
Well, okay, so here's the deal with the caravan. The reason that people join a caravan and the reason that lefty humanitarian organizers in Central America organize these is because they're saying, hey, you know what? This normal system where most women are raped and this normal system where everyone who crosses through Mexico across the border has to keep paying the cartel for 10 years and wiring money back to them. We're going to not let that happen here, and we're going to organize. We're going to get media attention for protection, and we're going to go across Mexico and go to the U.S. border, so that the entire existence of a caravan, the point of the caravan, is actually to disempower the cartel and to keep people safe from the behaviors of the cartels. So that's why when you see groups like Judicial Watch saying like, oh, there's ISIS fighters in the caravan, that's probably I mean, that's like saying maybe there's aliens in Antarctica. I don't know that there's not aliens in Antarctica or extraterrestrials. I can't prove there's not, but there's absolutely no reason to suggest that there is, or that there are. And, people join caravans for protection from the cartels on their route to the U.S. border, to the U.S. border.
So the way the U.S. media is reporting the caravan is sort of like it's a challenge on Trump, which, on some level, of course, it is. But that's not really the intention, is it? The intention is not politics, it's physical security for something they wanted to do anyway?
Correct.
Wow.
That is correct. And that's why you're going to see, but we're not going to see a caravan show up at our border. We might. But like the last caravan, did it ever show up at our border? No. What happened is they get to Mexico City and then they disperse. And they go in smaller groups. They work out things with different Catholic churches or different aid groups. And then they come in smaller groups to the U.S.-Mexico border. And you start to see some show up here, some show up there, some show up there.
But wait.
So a lot of this is...
But wait. So, but that argues against the caravan protecting them, because they wouldn't have trouble just traveling to Mexico City, would they? I mean,
yeah, they definitely would. Yeah, they definitely would. So the area in Chiapas that they all have to go through when they cross from Guatemala is cartel controlled, and it's like really heavily like influenced by Los Zetas and parts of the Gulf cartel. So it really starts that soon. So once they get to Mexico City, then they can go along the western coast and they go through Sinaloa territory, where the Sinaloa cartel doesn't really care they don't make much money off illegal immigration. They don't really care, right? So they just don't care that much about it. They're really heavily focused on narcotics and legitimate businesses and investments that they get into to launder the money. So it doesn't take away from it at all. But that's what they do, and that's what happens historically. Is they get there, there's some political stuff that goes on. They get some pressure from Mexico, the organizers do, and they work out different ways. So you still have larger groups of people showing up, but that aren't paying the Gulf cartel and Los Zetas to smuggle them in. But it's not thousands of people in one bulk, in a big bulk or a big mass coming to the border. That's not what we've seen historically. It may happen this time, but it hasn't happened historically. And the problem is there's a lot of fake news about this, right? Like the left is saying that they're doing it to challenge Trump. I'm sure there's some organizer there who wears a Che hat who thinks of challenging the U.S. government. I'm sure there's other organizers who are just Catholic and feel like they're doing under the least of these. I'm certain of that there's multiple different people involved here that probably don't get along and have different visions of what they're doing. But on the right, we also have a lot of fake stuff. Like we have people claiming that they're ISIS fighters, that terrorists are using it to get in secretly, and that's just not how it works in Mexico. Terrorists who want to come here, and there are people connected to terror organizations, generally those people have to go through what? They have to sneak in, and they have to go through the couple of cartels who don't care about tomorrow, right? They can't. The Sinaloa cartel is not going to cross a terrorist. The Sinaloa cartel wants to make money 10 years from now. So, it's the Gulf cartel. So the terrorist isn't going to go where all the cameras are and all the news media is.
It's starting to sound like the best play for the United States is to back the Sinaloa cartel, because if they take over the other cartels, they're easier to deal with.
Well, okay, so here's the issue with that. If in a weird de facto way, in a roundabout way, that's what we do. If you look at the INL dollars, right? So the U.S. gives money to the Merida Initiative. The Merida Initiative manifests in Mexico in what's called the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Effort. That's our State Department's effort to fight cartels, right?
Right.
And if you look at the way that the U.S. pressures Mexico to go after cartels, almost 90-some-odd% of all of the efforts are against the Gulf cartel and Los Zetas, and they leave the Sinaloa cartel alone. That's what they do. They largely leave them alone. There are some one-offs, whatever, but they largely leave them alone. They go after the enemies of the Sinaloa cartel.
And what is keeping the cartels from fighting each other? Do they have an agreement, or they are fighting each other?
No, they're killing each other. That's why there's been over 125,000 people dead in the last decade in Mexico in this cartel war. There's over 56,000 people missing, and that's just what we know about.
Wait, 56,000. I'm sorry. Give me those numbers with a time frame again.
Okay, so everyone has different estimates. I think the best estimates come out of the University of New Mexico. A lady named Molly Malloy, who I'm sure doesn't appreciate that a Breitbart editor likes her or likes her work because she's very liberal. But she has the best estimates. She estimates around 125,000 have been murdered in the last decade in the drug. They call it the drug war, but it's really, it's also an illegal immigration war, right? Like I said earlier, it's the cartel wars. Over 125,000 have been killed in the last decade. Over 100 journalists have been murdered in the last decade. Over 56,000 people are missing, disappeared. No one knows where they are in the last decade. That's how bad it is. We've had 17 journalists murdered in Mexico just this year in 2018. It's pretty bad. That's more journalists than have been murdered anywhere else in the world right now.
Wow. This stuff's amazing. So what would you suggest that the U.S. does about the caravan? What, in a perfect world, do you have the best information? Is there anything we could or should do?
Yeah, definitely. But I think it's really important, though, that people remember, I'm a news editor, right? I want to tell you the news, but I also have to bring in traffic, right? I have to fund the salaries of my people, okay?
Right.
Of my team. So focusing on the caravan is hot stuff right now. Oh, it's hot. But the reality is that what different sectors have at Border Patrol have different numbers. But the average is about 50. They think we catch about 50 to 55% of the people who come in across the border between ports of entry, and that like I said, the others get in, they sneak in, right? But the reality is that we've had 400,000 human beings come across that border illegally or irregularly in 2018. So the caravan, will be 4,000 to 7,000 people, but that really represents a really small portion of the people who have come across illegally this year alone. So what we have to realize is that there's basically a much larger caravan, number-wise, of people who cross our border illegally, come to our border every month. There's more than that come to our border. And focusing on the caravan is really, it's a little bit silly because there's, like I said, there's been over 400,000 human beings who have done this already this year.
So, the counter argument would look like this. If you didn't treat it like it was a big problem, it would become one. So that the big problem is not the size of the problem today. The big problem is what will it turn into if we don't deal with it today. So isn't that how you size it?
No, this is what it's already turned. This is what it's turned into. This is the result of our policies. I was speaking with. Hold on. So right now there's one caravan. Maybe it's doubled to say 15,000 people. If there's
two caravans. I guess together they're 15,000, right? So if they all got in and it worked out well, there would be more caravans.
Oh, 100. No, I agree with you. That's not. So when we say what can we do about it, the first thing to mention is that talking about the caravan. Let's talk about the issue, why the caravan exists, right? Not only because of their safety, but let's talk about why they're coming. They're coming because, one, it sucks to live where they are. That's called a push factor.
Right.
And two, we have policies that encourage them to come here. That's called a pull factor. When we're talking about irregular migration or illegal immigration, however you want to call it.
All right. So people on comments are desperately asking you to suggest solutions because they can see.
I got one.
Okay, go.
The biggest thing we can do, it's all about our policies, right? So it's easy for us to look at that caravan and go, stop those people. Those people are the enemy. No. The enemy are the lawmakers we have who leave laws on the books that encourage those people to come here. Republicans have control and they could change this. Democrats had 2009 and 10 where they could have changed it and they didn't. We have laws that encourage this. People are encouraged to come here. If we had a policy that said, it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, why you're here, how old or young you are, if you come here illegally, you are going home. If we had that policy, none of this would be happening.
But if we
It
had,
has to be a policy change.
but hold on, nothing's free. So if we had that policy where we did send people back if they came here illegally, no doubt about it. And does that include people who legally apply for asylum? What would you do with them?
Well, that's the catch. We have to change that because, see, people don't realize a lot of the reason no one wants to change the asylum laws is because how they came about. They came about like largely in the 1960s, and they came about as a result. They were formalized in the 60s. They came about as a result of things that happened in World War II. You look at several ships of kids who came who were Jewish kids. They came in during World War II. The U.S. turned them back because we couldn't process all of their claims.
I'm having trouble believing that anything that happened in the 60s is having much impact on whether we change a law in 2018.
Okay. Why else wouldn't we change the law? Because see, the problem is if you're being called, and you're very good at this with framing and narratives.
Well, no, let me answer the question. The reason we would have asylum laws is because some people are legitimate asylum seekers and have legitimate danger, and that's the country we want to be. So your suggestion, and I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying there are costs and benefits. The cost of turning everybody back would be that, unless they came in legally, the cost would be that the asylum seekers who are legitimate would not have an outlet in the United States. They might still have some other resources, but they wouldn't have the United States. Would that be acceptable? Is that a big problem or a small problem?
Well, we're in a situation. It's hard to answer that because here's the situation we're in. If we have a policy, which is what we have right now, that says all you have to do is set foot on U.S. soil and claim asylum, and then we're going to sort it out, and you get to be released into the U.S. until we sort it out. If we continue to have that policy, we're going to continue to have 400,000 or more people illegally or crossing our border asking for asylum every year. That's what we're going to have. So we're going to have to choose. We're going to have to make some hard decisions and go, we have an either or right now. We're either going to change those laws and make it where people can't do that, or make it where they have to do it in a foreign country and we have areas set up that we've rent from a foreign country as camp. I don't know. We're either going to change it or we're going to have this problem. There's no way around it.
What number of people do you think coming across the southern border, there's probably just no way to know this, but best guess, what percentage of all the refugees do you think are legitimate asylum seekers? Meaning that if we had a way to know their real story, that the U.S. would say, oh yeah, you guys come on in, we want to help you. Do you think that's 5% or 40%?
Okay, well this is where it gets tricky because there's all of, I listen to talk radio quite a bit, and people will say, I hear all these people with these resolute opinions, like, no, this is technically not requiring asylum, and no, this does, and no, this doesn't. And really, it's a lot of gray area, right? So when I meet people, I personally feel like probably out of just anecdotally, 90-something% of people I meet, I think, you know what, they're a good person, and I think, I wish they could stay here. I understand, but you got to understand, a lot of these people, they come from areas that are physically controlled by paramilitary transnational criminal groups we call cartels. Their journalism, their media is controlled, their politicians are controlled. When most people in Mexico who are taken by the cartel are taken and killed, it's actually the military or the cops who killed them for the cartel. That is what we're dealing with. So I think we could make the argument that every dang one of them should get asylum somewhere. But then we also have to balance that with the reality that we have financial responsibilities, that we have to take care of our own communities. How to balance that, I'm not really sure.
Okay. Got it. I'm going to want to wrap this up in a minute because I like to keep these to a certain size. And oh my God.
Fun though.
Yeah.
I love this. I love being here.
And my God, this is the most useful discussion I've ever seen on this topic. I'm watching some of the comments and people are saying the same thing. Let me ask, I'm just asking the viewers here. You haven't heard most of this stuff, have you? I mean, I think this completely changes how you look at the situation, and so I really thank you for that. Brandon, is there anything that maybe I should have asked, or something that would give us a little extra context that we haven't talked about?
Well, I think that we're in a situation where this is obviously a hot button issue for good reason. I think it is a significant problem, but we're just going to have to acknowledge that there are some hard truths here that we have to deal with. Like the hard truths are, our laws encourage poor people and people in dangerous situations to come here. They are in dangerous situations, but if we're going to be a country that takes everyone in the world who's in danger, we're going to go broke if we also have a system of entitlements. We're going to go broke. What do we do with that? I don't know. But I think that the things to remember are that multiple things can be true at once. You know, like if you listen to the Center for Immigration Studies, they talk about the negative cost, the costs of illegal immigration, and they're telling the truth. And you listen to some liberal groups and they're talking about the benefits of illegal immigration. They can both be true at the time. Some groups in our country can benefit from illegal immigration. Some groups can be hurt by illegal immigration. All of these things can be true, and I think that there's need for a nuanced discussion. But what I see right now is I see two polar sides, and both sides are a little bit full of it when it comes to this issue. One side is claiming everyone coming here is a terrorist trying to exploit us, and the other side is claiming that everyone coming here is a loving human being who just wants to take care of their children. And neither one of those is true. They're partially true, right?
Yeah.
So we have to have real discussions about this. And let's encourage everybody to remember that we're talking about human beings. Remember that we can't afford to take on the whole world's problems. And let's have an honest discussion.
All right, that was a perfect summary. Thank you so much. As I said, I'm watching the comments again, and people are confirming this is just the best thing they've seen on this topic. So thank you so much. We've been talking to Brandon Darby, Director of Breitbart's Border and Cartel Projects, and you should check out his writing. What's your Twitter, Brandon?
It's at Brandon Darby.
At Brandon Darby, BrandonDarby.
Hey, thank you.
All right, and I'm going to sign off of this. I might do another Periscope after this on a different topic. I want to keep this just to a tight topic. All right, that's it for now. I'm going to sign back on a different topic.